Hello everyone, this is Kyle Davison Bear. Welcome back to part 3 of this response video to Nick Brasing and Josh Bowen. Again, you can find me at the Hope You're Curious YouTube channel and pastorkyle.substack.com for the blog. And this has been a really fun challenge to respond to their response. I don't know if you've heard of the documentary effect, but essentially, if you watch a documentary on something, usually you become utterly convinced that what you just saw is true because you've only seen one part of it and you've seen a presentation crafted to convince you of that part of it. But then suppose you watch a documentary made to refute the first documentary. Typically, then you become convinced that the second documentary is accurate because now you've seen a compelling presentation of that side. But you haven't seen the first one come back and say, actually, they overstated their case here. What they said here is not true. So then you watch the third response, and now you're getting a really in-depth, really rich understanding of the issue. You're not just being blindly taken to one side or the other, but you can see claim, counterclaim, evidence. You get to really dig deep. And I feel like that's what we've been able to do here, really go deep into this conversation. And today, this part will focus more on Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Leviticus 25 especially is what this whole video has been about. Then Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 23:15-16 have informed that. But we'll be able to get deeper into Leviticus and Deuteronomy in this video. So I think you're going to enjoy it. Yeah, let's get into it.
No. So we'll skip forward to where he comes back.
Someone who has been kidnapped and forced to be a slave, you are put to death. So if you don't understand that verse and you try to read Leviticus 25, you read it wrong.
That I can completely agree with.
Because you read Leviticus 25 as if it's saying you can buy a slave.
Explain that to me, Nick. So what did you mean by that?
Well, he says if you misread Leviticus 21:16, if you misunderstand Exodus 21:16, you're going to misread Leviticus 25, which is exactly what he goes on to do.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
His misunderstanding of Exodus 21:16 to, well, they can't be slaves. I know it sounds like they're slaves, but they can't be because that's outlawed in Exodus 21:16.
I see. Yes.
And this is where it all comes back to the word ebed again. Because as we've seen, ebed can mean every type of service position throughout society. There's nothing limiting it to mean only slave. It refers to everything from a host serving his guests to the Messiah, the suffering servant, to a soldier serving a commanding officer, to a servant being paid daily for their contribution, to workers in the field who are being paid as day laborers. It refers to every one of those levels. So when you see ebed in Leviticus 25, there is nothing forcing it to mean slave and only slave. That's what I'm saying. You see ebed, you have to look at the context to see what's being talked about, what's been prohibited, what's been allowed. You need to ask those questions or you misread the text. Exodus 21:16 outlaws stealing someone against their will, selling them as a slave against their will, and possessing someone who has been sold as a slave against their will. Which is why I say that it should not be translated slave here in Leviticus 25. Because even if this happens in a foreign nation, somebody kidnaps a slave, brings them in, sells them to an Israelite. Exodus 21:16 makes it illegal for that Israelite to possess someone who has been captured and sold into slavery against their will.
Understood.
From a foreign nation, you can buy someone who's been forced to be a slave. You can buy someone for cash and possess them for cash. You can't, because
this is where he goes too far. Let me back it up a little bit. So I think I talked over it a tad. This is where he goes from not just a kidnapped person to it's anyone.
If it's saying you can buy a slave from a foreign nation, you can buy someone who's been forced to be a slave, you can buy someone for cash and possess them for cash, you can't, because Exodus 21:16 outlawed that.
Okay.
That's the Kaz of the Grand Canyon that I was talking about. He jumps over from you can't kidnap somebody to you can't buy them, you can't own them, you can't sell them. Any slave. Just as a recap for anybody who didn't watch parts 1 or 2, we've been talking about using the words that conjure the right thing in your head so that what you read on the page conjures the right thought in your mind that reflects what's actually going on in the passage. My argument has been this word ebed can be translated in so many different cases. It should only be translated slave when the situation it's describing reflects what comes to our minds when we think about a slave. So when Egypt enslaved Israel, put them through backbreaking work, killed their children, wouldn't let them go. Yeah, that's slavery. When Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and Potiphar bought him as a slave, yeah, use the word slave because that's what it's describing. But in Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25 here, it is not describing those situations, which is why I say it should not use the word slave. It should use the word servant or something like that. Because Exodus 21:16 is not just a prohibition against kidnapping. The first line is, whoever steals a person shall be put to death. Yeah, that's against kidnapping. But it's the second and third lines, whoever sells such a person, whoever possesses such a person shall be put to death. That's why I say it outlaws all slavery, because you cannot possess someone who has been stolen away from their freedom and sold into slavery against their will. That's what we think of when we think of slavery. We don't think of someone signing up willingly for it. That would be more like a servant. That would be something like, Downton Abbey, a servant being hired to serve the lord of the manor. We don't think of slaves signing up to be slaves. It just does not compute. You were forced into slavery against your will. That's part of what we conceive of as slavery. Your master doesn't let you go. They can brutalize you. Those are the things that come to our minds when we think of the word slave. So no, Exodus 21:16 does not allow you to do that. Leviticus 25 would not allow someone to possess someone who has been sold into slavery against their will. That's what we think of as slavery, which is why I say Exodus 21:16 abolishes slavery. It makes it impossible to do what we saw in the American South, for them to steal Africans from Africa, sell them at slave auctions against their will, possess them when they've been stolen and sold against their will. It makes all of that illegal. What we think of as slavery is outlawed by that verse. The trouble comes in when people refer to the entire economic system as slavery, even when it's describing a servant who is serving because they choose to, because they're getting well paid to, well compensated to. And that's just no end of confusing to the modern reader.
Let me try to be gracious. Let me be charitable.
One of us
and see if I can read into what he said there when he used the word forced into slavery. If he is carrying the idea that if a person is in a foreign land and they are kidnapped by another foreigner, and if that's what he means by forced, and then that person, let's say Frank, the Moabite, I don't know, kidnaps Jim, the Moabite, who's a free person, makes him a slave, and then Frank brings Jim to Israel and says, got a slave for sale. Here's Jim. And then Israelite Tom, I know I'm using goofiness, sorry, but purchases Jim. Then that transaction, particularly if Tom knows that he's been kidnapped, is not allowed. I don't think that's in the mind of the writer in Leviticus 25. I don't think that's there. But
no, I don't either.
And this is where we have to be really careful at trying to keep our biases out of our assumptions, because we cannot read the minds of someone who lived 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. We cannot read the mind of, whether you think it's Moses writing this passage as I do, or whether you think it's some other writer. We cannot read their minds. We are so many thousands of years removed. We cannot speculate as to what was in their mind or what was not, and it's fruitless to say so. But what we can do is look at what's on the page, what has already been written, what's come before, what comes after. That we can know with certainty. And we can also see archaeologically what's going on. Maybe not as clear a picture archaeologically as we get in the text, but still very informative. And what is written on the page is that if you steal someone against their will, you sell them, or you possess them, you are put to death. What we can also see is that this is present in Genesis. It happens to Joseph. It happens in Egypt. They purchase slaves. It's normative. Then what we see is that after these laws come, after God gives this law, that stuff disappears from the narratives. We have scores of narratives about life in biblical Israel, and none of that stuff happens again. You don't see a single person kidnapped and sold to slave traders. You don't see slave traders moving through the land at all. You don't see slave markets. You do not see someone being stolen as a free person, sold into slavery, and purchased by someone in Israel against their will. It just disappears completely. You see it in the land before Israel takes over. After Israel takes over, it disappears. That's what's on the page. That's what we can say with certainty. We cannot speculate about what was or was not in the mind of a writer, but we can say, this is what was written. This is what the passages describe. So I would argue that, yeah, Exodus 21:16 does prohibit possessing someone who's been sold into slavery against their will, which is why it disappears from the narrative entirely.
And yet that's exactly the assumption we make about Leviticus 25. We assume that's what it's talking about because we don't read Exodus first. If we did, we would know that's being outlawed. So Leviticus 25 cannot be talking about buying people who have been forced to be a slave. It cannot be talking about paying money in exchange for someone as property. It can't be talking about that because Exodus already outlawed it.
How did Exodus outlaw
Yeah.
buying somebody for money?
It's very simple. If you can't sell people, you can't buy people. Exodus 21:16 prohibits stealing people away from their freedom, selling them, and possessing them. If you can't sell these people, you can't buy them. You can't buy them if nobody can sell them. That's how it outlaws buying people for money. It outlaws buying people who have been forced into slavery against their will. The confusion comes up later because you can exchange money to a servant, you can hire somebody to come work for you, but you cannot buy someone who is being forced into slavery against their will because it is illegal to sell such a person and it is illegal to possess such a person. That is how it outlaws buying people.
That's another argument he made in my discussion with him online,
Yeah.
which is when it says, because I quoted him verses, whether a slave is born, whether the slave was born in my house or I bought it with my money.
Yep.
And he goes, well, that money wasn't paid for the slave. It was paid to the slave because you couldn't pay somebody because of Exodus 21:16.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a nonsense statement.
So this again is why translation is so key, because you can use words that unfairly bias the reader towards one interpretation or the other without realizing it. Take the word kana, which is what's translated by in Leviticus 25:44, and the word ebed, for slave or servant. Now, kana can mean buy. It can mean I bought a piece of land. It can also mean, in Genesis 4:1, Eve uses it to describe giving birth. She acquired a child by giving birth to him. It's referring to God. He is the possessor, the acquirer of heaven and earth. He acquired it by creating it. So kana can refer to any type of acquiring whatsoever. Giving birth, creating, buying, hiring. Anything can fall under that umbrella. Ebed, as we've talked about, can mean slave. It can also mean any other type of servant. A day laborer, someone who signs up to serve, like you would, again, conceive of as Downton Abbey. A servant who's being paid to serve the Lord of the Abbey. When the words can mean so many different things, you really have to be careful how you can translate them. Because if you have kana and you have ebed in the sentence, you could translate it buy a slave. You could also translate it acquire a servant. Each one biases you towards thinking about something different. When you hear buy a slave, you assume it means you're buying this from a slave trader. You're buying it from a slave market because no one signs up to be a slave. We think of slavery as something you're forced into. When someone buys a slave, you're buying someone who's shackled, who's being forced into slavery against their will. That's what we assume. If you hear the phrase acquire a servant, again, I think immediately of Downton Abbey. I think of a servant who is applied to the manner of the household. They're being hired. This is the wage we'll pay you. These are your job responsibilities. At any time you want to, you can leave. Again, that's the assumption I make when I hear that. So when we know in the modern audience, these are the assumptions we make about these words, we have to be really, really careful about which words we use in the passage so that what we're saying, what translation we use, accurately conveys what's going on. So you mentioned here, Nick, that I said the money's going to the person directly and not to a third party. The reason I said that about Leviticus 25 is because there is no third party. There are no slave traders. There is no slave market. There is nobody selling these people. There is just the wealthy Israelite landowner and the Ebed, the servant, or whatever you want to translate it as. There's just those two people. And there's the word kana. The wealthy Israelite, kana, this servant. Again, if you assume it's a slave and you're being bought, then you assume this third-party slave trader who's not mentioned. If you assume it's a servant who's being acquired or hired or paid a wage, you assume it's just the landowner and the servant, and those are the only two people who are actually mentioned within the passage itself. So it's the assumptions that you bring into the passage. I said, I think, in the first part, the words on the page are fine. It's the assumptions that you make about the words that are leading us into trouble. And this is what I mean. If you assume there's a third party present, if you assume they're being bought as a slave, you assume a slave trader who's not mentioned. If you assume it's just a servant being acquired, you don't need a third party. You can have just what's actually on the page, the wealthy landowner hiring or acquiring a servant, paying them directly. When you have a passage like Exodus 21:16 that makes it illegal to possess someone who's being sold against their will, I would argue it outlaws having a third party present, having a slave trader who's trying to sell slaves to a wealthy landowner. The act of doing so, possessing someone who's been sold into slavery against their will, is illegal, which is why I say the way this passage should be understood is acquiring a servant. That the money is going from the wealthy landowner to the Ebed, to the servant, directly. I say there is no third party because one is not mentioned, it is only assumed, and I would argue that Exodus 21:16 makes such an assumption wrong. It's been outlawed.
I mean, you
Yeah.
can, like, there are absolutely people that go into debt. Let's say Tom goes into debt.
You could sell yourself. Certainly you could.
Right. If Tom goes into debt to Bob, he owes him 100 shekels of silver or something. Let's just say Tom can go to Jim and say, Jim, I'll sell myself to you as a slave for 100 shekels of silver so I can pay Bob his 100 shekels of silver. And so then, you get, okay, all right, I hear 100 shekels. I mean, you're a very expensive slave. You're 100 shekels of silver, but, you definitely can do that. But
absolutely.
I just don't understand.
But all of them, you couldn't because of Exodus 21:16.
Yeah, it's just a nonsense statement.
And you're making my case for me right now, because what you just described is what is possible. You sell yourself. You choose yourself to sign up for 6 years of service to pay back your debt, or whatever number of years you agree to, but no more than 6. After which you are free. The person you served loads you down with wealth. As the Lord has blessed him, he is commanded to bless you. You go off wealthier. You are free. You don't have to buy your freedom. It's yours by right. That's what's allowed. And it's not slavery. It has nothing to do with slavery as we conceive the term. You're signing up for it yourself. You know you're going to be free after a few years. You know you're going to come out wealthier than you went in. While you're there, your rights are being protected. Any abuse you suffer, any permanent injury automatically frees you. It's not slavery. That is what is allowed, correct. You can sign yourself up, but it is not slavery, which is why we have to stop using that term to refer to it. And to make the case even stronger that the Bible outlaws slavery, Deuteronomy 23:15-16 just makes it so clear. Deuteronomy 23:15-16 says, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you." Do you hear that? If someone is a slave and they're being, and they've escaped from that servitude, you cannot return them.
Oh, wait. So the law says, if you have a slave, you get put to death. Then, and according to his lights, then it says, if you have a slave and he runs away, you can't return him to the master. Why aren't we putting the master to death for owning a slave?
We don't ask questions like that.
Oh, damn. Guess you could own slaves.
So who does Deuteronomy 23 refer to if you can't own slaves in Israel? Everyone. It refers to every layer of society, every level of service, anyone who is serving anyone else, because that's what Ebed means, one who serves. Any servant at any level, in any capacity. Whatever you're doing, whatever job it is, however you got into it, if it's bad enough that you need to leave, you can. Now the law grants you freedom. As soon as you do, you cannot be returned. So yes, this applies to foreign slaves in other countries who escape to Israel. They get their freedom as well. But the great thing about Deuteronomy 23 is that it has no qualifications. It's every Ebed, anyone who can be described by the term Ebed. So even if someone in Israel is trying to keep slaves illegally, or they started out, with willing participants or whatever, and they just got worse and worse and worse until it became functionally slavery, they can escape as well. Deuteronomy 23:15-16 protects them. This law grants freedom to anyone who is serving at any level of society, anywhere in the country. It has no qualifications. It's just anyone who can be referred to as an Ebed. Anyone who is serving someone else can escape if they need to. If the situation is bad enough that they do escape, the law protects their right to do so. So yes, you can have a lot of people working for you, but they're not slaves. They can all be described by the word Ebed, but they're not slaves. Because Ebed can describe every kind of service at every level, the willing and the unwilling.
And when you have a lot of people who are serving you willingly, it can be a lot of people. They can all be described by the word ebed. And they're not slaves. They're not there against their will. Someone you purchased from a slave trader who's slaving them against their or selling them against their will. It's not that, because that's outlawed. But there are so many other kinds. Again, like I said in the first part, the word ebed is used 800 times in the Old Testament. Over 90% of them have nothing to do with slavery. It refers to so many things beyond just slaves. And this verse, Deuteronomy 23, refers to every kind of ebed at every level of society. Yes, it includes slaves and every other level. So you can have many, many, many people working for you, all of them called ebed, and none of them slaves.
I think he touches on Exodus 21, 26 to 27 and things like that. If you beat your slave, you can't. You have to let them go free. Well, how can they own a slave? Shouldn't they already be put to death?
Yeah.
Now they only have to set them free, but they're not put to death unless they kill them.
They don't own a slave. They have servants. Exodus 21 just defined it for you. It opens with a person who signs up to work for 6 years to work off their debt. It talks later about a maid who's, a girl who's working as a maid in somebody's house, later marries into the house. She's treated as a daughter, as a wife. Neither of these are slaves. The word ebed might be used to describe this guy, but he is not a slave. He is a servant. He has rights. He's signing up of his own free will. He'll go free in a few years. He'll go free wealthier than he entered. His rights are being protected. He's not a slave. So they are not being owned as slaves. But even this person who signs up to work for 6 years, who knows he's there of his own volition, if the person he's working for gets abusive and knocks out a tooth, he's released. He's out of there. Why would that law need to exist? Because this guy has every incentive to stay. For 6 years, he works off his debt. He leaves. He's loaded down with wealth. He has every incentive to stay. But if the person he's working for begins to be abusive, the law says, no, you're out of there. You don't tolerate that. It's not talking about owning slaves. It's talking about having servants working for you. Remember that ebed refers to every level of service. Yes, slaves, but only a very minority number of the cases. The majority of the time, it's referring to servants. It's referring to people who are serving of their own will, which is what's going on in Exodus 21. Again, this is the confusion that happens when you just throw out the translation slave in a passage where the context does not fit.
This is the easiest one. I mean, Exodus 21:16, you can argue, who does it apply to? That's a valid, scholarly argument. I'm not sure how scholars, you could speak to that. I don't think there's been a poll taken on where they stand, but at best it's 50-50. It's probably more on the line of it's probably Hebrew. Exodus 21:16, that's kidnapping. But by the time you get to Deuteronomy, it specifies it's only for a Hebrew if you kidnap a fellow Hebrew. And then beyond that, if you go the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, done, before Christ, what was it, 400 BC, somewhere?
All that stuff is I think debated, and it's but the old Greek might be in the.
It was done, not closer to the time that Exodus would have been written than closer to our time before Jesus. So when they translate Exodus 21:16, the Hebrew scholars of the time, of the day, way back then, they translated in the Septuagint into Greek, they translated Exodus 21:16 as if you kidnap a fellow Hebrew, so that it would match the passage in Deuteronomy. That's what Josh is saying, is that,
the Greek, so the Hebrew, as you're saying, is that if anyone who steals a man, an ish, right, as you're saying, like this means like somebody, the Greek, and if someone might steal someone from among the sons of Israel,
right,
is what it says. So when it translates it adds from among the sons of Israel to bring it in line with, and I'll look at just real quick, Deuteronomy 24:7. So if a man is caught kidnapping a brother, his brother from among the sons of Israel, or of the sons of Israel. So I think it's just probably, most scholars would say, just bringing it in line with Deuteronomy 24:7.
As to the question of who Exodus 21:16 refers to, I'm always in favor of looking at the words on the page. That's where you should find your answer. not trying to read into it a whole bunch of things that it might mean in other different cases, but no, what's on the page. And the word ish for man, it is used throughout the law as something called the masculine universal, where using a man, the word, ish, it includes everybody, even though it just says man. In a very clear case, to take us out of the slavery discussion, just Deuteronomy 19:11. If a man hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him and attacks him and strikes him fatally so that he dies and he flees into one of the cities, and then it goes on from there. Now that's not just saying men only. It doesn't mean that women have the freedom to hate for someone and lie in wait for them and kill them. And if women do that, there's no reprisal from the law. No, of course. It refers to everyone. It uses the masculine as a universal to refer to everyone. Same thing in Exodus 21:16. You brought up the case of Deuteronomy 15 and how that one specifies a Hebrew brother. And that kind of proves my point. If you want to specify the law to be referring only to a Hebrew person, you can quite easily. Exodus 21:2 does, but Exodus 21:16 does not. It is universal. And I would argue even that the prior verses, the prohibition against murder, again, is universal. These are not laws made only to Hebrew males, and if they were, it's very easy to write Hebrew brethren. Again, Deuteronomy 15 does, but Exodus 21:16 does not. So my argument will always be, what are the actual words on the page? What are the actual words of the verse in the original language? The Septuagint might have, inserted words into Exodus 21 from Deuteronomy 15. I'd say that's shame on them for doing that. I can understand why they did it, but don't add words to the verse. Let the word stand by itself. Let the verse stand by itself, focus on the words it's saying. That's what you need to look at. And the words of Exodus 21:16, as it is stated, is using the masculine universal just as it is in so many other laws. If a man does this, then this, and it refers to men, it refers to women, it refers to everybody, not just Hebrews, but everybody. If they had meant for it to be tied down, for it to refer only to Hebrew brethren, it could have said that. The plain words on the page, just the plain words that you have in Exodus 21:16, are universal. It does not limit itself only to Hebrews.
So I think we backtracked there, but we're on to Deuteronomy 23 and the runaway slaves. This, in my mind, is the easier argument to have because there aren't as many nuances to it. The scholarship, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the scholarship is fairly clear on what this means and who it applies to. So if you could spend a minute before we let him get into it to provide some background to the listeners, if you would.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that it, and I get it, right? You read this in the English, you don't think about it too closely. And it does seem to mean, like, to a person that just reads it like that, oh, it just means if any slave runs away. There are some things that I think most subject matter experts would say, yeah, this most likely is referring to a foreign slave who is escaping from a foreign land into Israel. So some of the phrases that sort of tip off the scholars, so that he shall dwell with you in your midst, in a place that he so chooses. This is something that doesn't really fit well with a fellow Israelite. Israelites, if they're being set free, they're going back to their land, right? Their allotted portion. So it doesn't really fit. Also, we have pretty decent parallels with ancient Near Eastern treaties where, and of course, Deuteronomy is part of this genre. It's part of this. Israel's not supposed to have, is not supposed to be subservient in any way. They're supposed to be the head, not the tail. So over the other nations, they're supposed to be the ones that are in power over a suzerain vassal.
Right. So they shouldn't be entering into treaties. I mean,
that's right.
If I can say, most nations would have a treaty with the nations around them that says, hey, if one of my citizen slaves escapes to your nation,
yep,
you'll return him to mine. And we have a reciprocity agreement where the same thing happens to me. We'll return them to you. The Bible seems to be pretty clear that Israel was not to enter into treaties with surrounding nations, that they were to be the symbol, if you will, or the things that the perfection. They shouldn't let other nations tell them what they can and can't do. They're the ones that should be telling. And so there is no agreement between returning slaves ours to yours or yours to ours. It's really not at its root, but part and parcel to a prohibition against entering into treaties with other nations regarding runaway slaves.
Again, my argument will be, what are the words on the page? We can't read the minds of the people back then. We can't say what they meant to do or what they didn't do. What we can do is see what's on the page. And Deuteronomy 23:15-16 is not written as a treaty. It is not written to refer to foreign slaves, to slaves who are fugitive crossing over into Israel. It would be easy enough to say that if that's what they meant, but Deuteronomy 23:15-16, as written, is as broad and inclusive as it would be possible to write such a law. You shall not give up to his master an ebed. No limits, no qualifications. Doesn't say foreigner, doesn't say local, doesn't say what kind of service, doesn't say how they entered the service. It's just as broad as you could possibly write a law. That's how it's written. Those are the words on the page. Now, you mentioned, treaties with other countries. Let's take one of the examples, a Hittite treaty with Alexandu of Walusa. If a fugitive, slave or free, comes from your land to me, I will not send him back to you. If a fugitive comes from my land to you, you shall not send him back to me. Pretty straightforward language. Very clear what they're talking about. Fugitives escaping across national boundaries. Which shows you how easy it is to write that, if that's what you mean. If that's the kind of law you're intending to write, it is very, very easy to write it and to specify it like that. Deuteronomy 23 does not. It does not contain those prohibitions. It does not limit it to foreign slaves crossing over into your territory. It is not written as a treaty, and it is not written with any kind of stipulation or limitation or qualification of any kind. The words on the page are as broad as possible. You shall not give up to his master an ebed who has escaped from his master to you. Period. Anyone, any ebed, from anywhere, for any reason, they're escaping. If you meant to write a law as broad as possible, this is how you would write it. Those are the words we have on the page. So yeah, I push back hard against this idea that it's only referring to foreign slaves escaping into Israel, because it doesn't say that. Even if there's some vague similarities to a law like the Hittite one, it is not written with that language. It does not have any kind of intent in the words that are on the page. So we can speculate all day long about what they meant, or did they draw this law from another law, but the actual words we have on the page do not limit it to foreign slave escapees in any way. It is as broad and inclusive as possible to refer to any ebed. That's what it says. That's what it means.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, and it is interesting. The verbiage here is, I think Sam Gringus is the one that pointed this out. I have to go back and look, but the fact that it's not, you're supposed to help him, the runaway slave. You're not supposed to bring him in and give him food and shelter. You're just supposed to take this sort of hands-off approach. Just wherever he wants to go, you just let him do his thing. Do not oppress him. But just, and I think probably the rationale for this, and I don't know if there's any consensus on this. These may just be more my musings than anything, but well, no, sir, I think certainly Sam Gring has talked about this. Sorry, is that when you read, I'm doing sort of an edition of the Laws of Hammurabi at the moment, and as you read through the law, ancient Near Eastern law is very concerned in many places with, did you purchase that person illegally? Can you track the chain of of custody or the chain of purchase? Can you provide witnesses for when you engage in that transaction? When you paid the money, are there witnesses? Do you have some type of documentation, some paper trail or some person trail that can show that it was a legitimate purchase? Can the seller also produce witnesses? How far can it go back? That sort of thing. But one of the things that you also see is that if a slave, there are lots of laws that are concerned about runaway slaves in the law collections. And usually what they're concerned about is if a slave runs away, and let's say they run away to my town, and here, slave Bob comes in, and citizen Jim sees him and takes him into his house. If he is found in his house and he doesn't bring him out when a herald comes around and says, hey, we're looking for this lost slave. It's as if he stole, Jim stole the slave Bob. And so like there's severe punishment for him. And so this very well may be, this whole hands-off approach may very well be in line with it, the reader knowing you don't take slaves into your house when they run away, because then it looks like you stole them, right? You're supposed to either bring them back to the master. You're supposed to bring, if you don't know who the master is and the slave won't tell you, you're supposed to bring it back to the palace, let the palace look into it, and then return it to the master. But you're not supposed to keep them in your house. So this very well may be just sort of making sure this whole above board, just let them live wherever they're going to live. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, you were harboring a runaway slave. Nope. He's over there. I'm just not obligated to return him. I'm not obligated to help you find him. I just hands-off approach. That's what the law says.
And again, I'll push back at this idea that Deuteronomy 23 is only a hands-off law. Just you don't touch the escaped slave. You let them do whatever they want. This law carries the force of a positive command, as do so many other commands throughout the scriptures. Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear a grudge. That's a negative. You shall not bear a grudge. You shall not take vengeance. But it requires positive action. You shall forgive. You shall seek reconciliation. You shall prioritize healthy communities and healthy relationships, not bearing your grudge and taking vengeance and destroying things. The Hebrew Bible talks this way so often. So when it says you shall not oppress him, you shall not wrong him, the implication is you shall do right by him. You shall not give him up to his master. No, you shall protect him. You shall keep him from being returned to his master. That's why many translations say he has taken refuge with you. It's not just he escaped and now he's in the land and you just watch him do his thing and don't get involved. No, it's he's taken refuge with you. So you ensure he does not get returned back to his master. He shall live among you. Let him live among you. Again, a positive force. You are to ensure, you are to let him live among you. He shall live among you wherever he chooses. You ensure that happens. This is not just don't get involved. This is he shall live with you wherever he wants. You shall not refer to him. He shall not be returned to his master. He shall not be oppressed. You shall do right by him, not wrong by him. So no, it completely misreads this passage to say it's just a hands-off approach. No, this is to seek the good, not to be not involved.
So, but what it doesn't mean, just to be clear, is that any slave in Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to put it in my discussions this way. You're suggesting that an Israelite could go to another nation, spend 30 shekels of silver, which was not an insubstantial amount at the time. That was a big number, to buy a slave, bring him home, set him up in his little room or bed or wherever they slept, and the slave could just get up the next morning, walk next door, and be free. Yeah. Where's the logic in that?
Yeah, I agree that there's no logic in that scenario because that scenario is entirely fictitious. It never appears in the biblical narratives. That's not what we're talking about. You never see an Israelite cross over into a foreign land, buy a slave, and bring them back into Israel. It doesn't happen. That's not what we're talking about. That action of buying a slave, especially someone who's been forced into slavery against their will, that's what Exodus 21:16 outlaws. You cannot kidnap someone, force them into slavery, sell someone into slavery against their will, or possess someone who has been sold into slavery against their will. So no, that never happens. Instead, it would be the kind of thing like, let me use the Downton Abbey example because that's a relatively modern, recent example of servants and lords where you have, it's just, we'll use that framework. Imagine a servant being hired to go to an abbey and they're serving the lord and lady of that abbey, of that house. They travel to there, they get their room set up, they start working, they start getting paid, but they can just tell something is off. Something is just not right about the situation. They work there for a few days, but they're getting the creeps, the way people are treating them. Like they just know, they know that this is not a safe to be. They can leave. And as soon as they leave, the Lord can't send the police down to arrest them and hogtie them and bring them back. No, they're free to leave. That's the kind of situation we're talking about. You are free to leave. Yeah, you may have had this working arrangement. They may have come expecting to work and to serve and to be paid and to be well taken care of. But if something goes wrong and they realize they need to leave, they can. That's what this law grants. Any abbot, any servant, anyone serving at any level, if you need to escape, if something's going on where you need to leave, you're free to. You cannot be returned to your master. That's, again, just the plain wording of Deuteronomy 23:15-16. There are no qualifications, no limitations. Any abbot at any level of society who leaves their master is not returned to their master. You see that they are free to go. And so, again, it creates this situation where, yeah, like modern day employment, even if you have this arrangement, you've written your name on a contract, if something goes wrong or you start getting treated poorly or you realize this is just not a good place to be, yeah, you can leave. That's the kind of situation we're talking about. Again, the idea of traveling to another nation, buying a slave and bringing them back, it never happens in the text. That's not what's going on. We don't need to invent a fake situation. And I'll say one final point. You made the argument that, this refers to foreigners because Israelites would have a family plot of land to return to. And again, if only life were so simple. The Bible is replete with examples of family drama, cases where you would not want to go back to your family if you suddenly had newfound freedom. The law doesn't require you to return to your ancestral plot of land. It doesn't require you to return to your family because that might not be a safe situation. You can go anywhere you like. So yeah, foreigners can go anywhere they like as well. Again, Deuteronomy 23 is written broadly. It includes everyone. It has no prohibitions or restrictions. But it also gives native Israelites the freedom. If they are the ones who need to escape and need to go free, they're not just shuttled back to a dangerous or potentially dangerous situation. They are free to go wherever, even if it's not their family plot of land they need to return to. So looking at this verse and saying that it must refer to foreigners because Israelites have a family plot of land too, that's adding a layer of interpretation over the verse that the verse itself does not.
Exodus 21:16 forbids you from forcing someone to be a slave against their will. It forbids buying people for money. It forbids possessing someone who has been sold for money or who has been forced to be a slave against their will. You do any of that, it's a death penalty. Deuteronomy 23:15-16 clarifies that if anyone escapes from a master.
If we could just pause for a second. Like this is why my comment was, this is just bad. Exodus 21:16 doesn't say anything about not forcing people to be slaves. Again, if all he means by that is not kidnapping them, sure, but that's a really misleading line.
And this is the danger of putting your interpretation over the text, and now all you're talking about is your interpretation of the text. You're not talking about what the text actually says, because you keep referring to the text as a law against kidnapping. Well, you can't kidnap people, you can't sell kidnap people. But Exodus 21:16, the base verse is so much broader than that. Kidnapping is a much narrower idea in our modern minds. Just the word is stealing, taking someone who is free, stealing them away from their freedom, making them a captive, making them a slave against their will. Selling the person is prohibited. Possessing a person who has been stolen away from their freedom and forced into slavery against their will is forbidden. So yes, the verse does speak against forcing people to be slaves against their will. That's exactly the point of it. You can't steal someone away from their freedom and force them to be a slave against their will. You can't sell them into slavery against their will. You cannot possess someone forced into slavery against their will. That's the plain reading of it. But when you put your interpretation over it, that this is only a prohibition against kidnapping and those are common, so that's all it means. No, remove that interpretation. Go back to the base level of what the verse is talking about. You cannot steal a person away from their freedom, sell them into slavery against their will, possess someone, sold into slavery against their will. Those are the ways you force someone to be a slave, and each one is prohibited, outlawed. So the whole point of the verse is to stop you from forcing someone into slavery against their will. It's illegal to possess such a person.
Well, and that's why I say he goes from reading Exodus 21:16 and saying kidnapping in the right places to never using that word again and making it broad for any reason.
Like having those second and third bullet points, no selling people as slaves, like that's not what Exodus 21:16 says.
Right.
It says don't sell kidnapped people, right? And not possessing people.
And as we've discussed, what matters here is what we think in the modern mind when you think of the word slave. You go back to your whole analogy about cake. You use a word that conveys to the modern mind what the meaning is. In our modern mind, a slave, someone in the antebellum South, the kind of thing we think of as slavery is someone stolen away from their freedom and forced to be a slave against their will, because nobody signs up to be a slave in the antebellum South. Nobody jumps into that willingly. They were all stolen away from their freedom in Africa. They were sold against their will. They were possessed against their will. If they escaped, they were beaten down, killed, or returned. They could not leave. They didn't have their freedom. They were forced into it against their will. When we think of slavery, we think of someone kidnapped, stolen away from their freedom, forced into it against their will. That is why the second and third bullet points here say no selling people as slaves, because we conceive of a slave as someone who was stolen and forced into this against their will. We conceive of possessing people as slaves as possessing someone who does not want to be a slave, who's been forced into this. They don't have the freedom to leave. That is what we think of as a slave, which is why I say it outlaws selling people as slaves and possessing people as slaves, because what we think of as slaves is outlawed by this verse.
I have, I think, written in my notes, this is the worst. I mean, this
Yeah.
little summary here
Yeah.
is where he takes, where he started with Exodus 21:16 and then just goes across the gorge and says, and because of that, you can't force in any way anyone to be a slave, which of course you could by birth, through debt, through war. You could. You
Sure.
couldn't sell anyone as slaves. You couldn't own a slave. Well, then what's the purpose of the runaway slave law in Deuteronomy if you couldn't own a slave?
Yeah.
What's Exodus 21:26-27? If you couldn't own a slave, what's the purpose of that? If it's being outlawed, a few verses before that. This just takes it way too far, which he's taken it further than almost anybody else that I've spoken to, and Deuteronomy 23 as well. These are the two legs to his wobbly stool on the Bible abolishing slavery.
And this is the danger, again, of arguing from your interpretation rather than the text. Because if the text uses the word ebed, you're putting the interpretation slave over that and only arguing from your interpretation that it must mean slave. You're forgetting that 90% of the time ebed is used, it does not mean slave. It refers to every level of service at every level of society. We cannot force this word to mean slave. The reason your examples don't seem to make sense in your mind is because you're forcing an interpretation on the word that is not justified by the context. So yeah, Exodus 21:16 forbids what we think of as slavery. So when you get down to Exodus 21, 26-27, like you mentioned, we're not talking about people like in the antebellum South chained up and forced into slavery against their will. You're right, that wouldn't make sense because we're not talking about that. That's already been outlawed. This is referring to every other kind of ebed, especially the ones detailed earlier in the chapter, people who are entering this willingly, whose rights are being protected, who cannot be sold because they're not slaves. If they are abused, they are released. Even if they're in the 6-year contract, it's no, just if you're abusing them, they're released. They're not slaves, and this verse is one of the key reasons why they have the freedom to leave. Their rights are protected. They are not what we think of as slaves. Same with Deuteronomy 23. You see the word ebed and you immediately assume it must mean slave and only slave. No, it refers to every kind of service at every level of society. As it does, 90% of the time it's used, not referring to slave, but referring to every other kind of servant. So you cannot force your level of your interpretation over the text and then argue just from your interpretation and talk about how things don't make sense. They don't make sense because you're looking at your interpretation of the text, you're not looking at the base level of what the text actually says. Go back to the word ebed. Don't put your interpretation that it must be referring to a slave. Let the text, each passage, look at the context, look at what it's saying, look at what it's forbidding, look at what it's protecting. And you call these my two wobbly stools, but they are so clear. Exodus 21:16 doesn't use the word ebed, so we don't have to worry about the definition of ebed. It just looks at the activities it's outlawing. You can't force someone to be a slave against their will. You can't steal them from their freedom, force them to be a slave, sell them as a slave against their will, possess someone who's been stolen as a slave against their will. So everything we conceive of as slavery, forcing someone into it, outlawed, in very clear, simple, easy to understand language. Deuteronomy 23 then clarifies that any ebed, anyone serving at any level of society, is always free to leave if they need to, and they cannot be returned back to their master. Again, very clear, very simple language. And let me again push back against all this trying to read other ancient Near Eastern laws into the text. That is so dangerous because, again, you are putting your interpretation over the text. The plain wording of the text is ingenious, and it is very different from these other laws. Like, you're seeing all the similarities to these other laws, and yeah, there are some similarities, but you're missing the differences. That it doesn't have the qualifications these other laws have. It doesn't have the limitations these other laws have. It doesn't limit itself to, treaty and returning fugitives. It doesn't have those limitations. Like, the differences are the point here. That these laws are written as widely as possible, as expansive as possible, and redefine how society works because of that. That you can't force someone to be a slave against their will. That's outlawed. If someone wants to leave whatever level of service, whatever kind of service, however they got into that service, anyone described by the word ebed, one who serves, anyone who serves, is always free to leave their master, the one they served. And as soon as they leave, they can't be returned. Those are the words on the page. That's how the laws are written. They are written as expansive and broad, as inclusive as possible. And when you look to other laws in other countries and say, well, this is what the law in the other country says, so we're going to assume the Bible means the same thing. No, look at the words actually on the page. Look at the differences. Look at why the differences are there. Look at how it changes the law, how it changes the situation to have those differences there. That's what we need to see. And I think we'll pause right here for the end of part 3. There's still some more information that I'd like to cover, but this has almost gotten to an hour, and I was hoping for half an hour. So to keep it as digestible as possible, we're just going to pause here, and next time there's some more to get into with Leviticus. That'll be really important to cover. That'll be coming at you, I don't know, whenever I can find the time. Who knows? But yeah, I hope this has been helpful to you. If you got any questions, drop them in the comments. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Yeah, let's keep digging into these texts. Look at the words on the page. The words God actually wrote, the words that are there in the law. Those are the words that set you free.